Governor Schaap was a Democrat. I believe he was first elected governor in 1970, and again reelected in 1974. But the further his administration went along, and the more I got to know people who admired him, the more I perked up and paid attention. He was doing things like making proclamations stating that henceforth state employees in the state of Pennsylvania would no longer be discriminated against for their orientation. And then not long after that, he said, well, he was going to investigate some sort of a task force to accommodate the needs and assess the situation for the gay and lesbian population. By that time, I had decided I was going to find all these people in the Sunbury, Snyder Union, Northumberland County area that I knew and get them together and see if we couldn't form a group. Where I was wrong, and I found out quickly, is they were interested in a group, but they weren't interested in politics. But I went ahead anyway, and I started traveling down to Philadelphia, and I heard about Gay Activists Alliance. And I found out where their meetings were, and somehow I believe I might have got in contact with Mark Siegel at that time. I read his name somewhere, heard about him, knew that he was involved in GAA, and was told I was welcome to come down. So I traveled down there to a couple of GAA meetings, talked to several people there, got my group together in Sunbury, started writing letters and making phone calls, got in contact with some other people. By this time, the Gay Rights Task Force meetings were starting to take place in the governor's office in the Capitol in Harrisburg, and there were no assigned positions. This was a task force, and the gay and lesbian community and friends, people who were interested, were invited to come into the governor's office. He had a huge conference room that was probably as long as this building. The table had to be a quarter of a football field long, I believe. And there were chairs, probably 30 chairs, maybe 35, 40 chairs seated around this big long table. And the table extended the length of the room. But the room would get so crowded with the participants and the people who were assigned to assess this gathering that people would come and stand along and line the walls. So we were coming from every part of the state. And this gave me even more opportunity to meet people from all the rural areas. I started meeting people from the Lehigh-Ho group in Allentown and from GCS Reading and GCS Harrisburg and the Lancaster group called Gays United Lancaster, or GUL, people from colleges. And some of the state members were starting to show up. They already had more or less been picked, like Dr. Walter Lear was the representative for the State Department of Health, and Barry Kahn and Earl Greensburg were there as attorneys in the State Department or Attorney Office, Attorney General's office, and Elizabeth Schuster was there, and a woman from the Department of Education, I can't think of her name, but anyway, different people from the state were starting to show up, and we started getting to know them, and there were a lot of discussions. These meetings would usually go on for a couple of hours in the afternoon, and then we'd gather down in the lunchroom on the basement of the Capitol and have refreshments together, and so we got to mingle. Eventually, in 1975, sometime around the midsummer, Mark Siegel and a friend of his, who I knew as Bill Way, came to Northumberland to help me with an organization meeting. And there were probably between 25 and 30 people, all men. gathered in my small apartment above the state liquor store on the 3rd floor in Northumberland. And that's where our organization meeting occurred. Meanwhile, the Governor's Council was appointed, and I had put in my name to be a community member, and the selection was made. And I was selected mainly because, and I don't doubt this one bit, I'm not being modest, I think it was because I lived in Podunk, Pennsylvania, and the other folks that had applied were from at least some size of city, and I think I did, people liked me, I was enthusiastic and so forth, but they wanted to include me, and I was very, very proud. Meanwhile, the people who had gathered around the edges of the conference room who wanted to participate, and they didn't give up and hang up their bags and go back home because there was a limited amount of seats on the council. Even before the council members were named, we started a rural group because Philadelphia had their organizations, Pittsburgh had their organizations, and there were lots of us in between who we now knew each other. The connections had been made, the ball was rolling, and we got together and decided to have meetings, and we formed the Pennsylvania Rural Gay Caucus. And I think that was started, as far as I know, sometime in the late summer or early autumn of 1975 is when we first met. And probably officially the first meetings were held after Governor's Gay Rights Task Force meetings. The rural people would sort of huddle together and start conversations. So we met and traveled from city to city around Pennsylvania, and I thought that was terrific. And of course I was at every meeting I could get to. And one of the first major steps that the Rural Caucus took was to say, we've got to do something to educate the legislators here who didn't know anything and were calling us all sorts of names and making all sorts of comments. We've got to do something. So I volunteered to help. So I think Joe Burns was in charge of the caucus in an informal setting at that time, and he, with more or less unanimous agreement of those attending at that meeting, he appointed myself and a woman named Lynn, and I can't think what her last name is, and she was from Wilkes-Barre and was also attending that meeting. We were to be the co-chairs, and there were other people who raised their hands, and they were our first Lobby Day committee members. Well, I remember we started holding meetings weekly from probably October, when that first was decided, until March, I believe it was March 18th or 23rd, one of those two dates, and it's in our notes somewhere, is when Lobby Day was held. And we held meetings weekly, almost weekly, if not every week, and got together and started devising ways to let everybody know and invite Pittsburgh, invite Philadelphia, plan buses, plan the time, plan what we were going to use, how we were going to identify ourselves, where we were going to meet, what subjects we wanted people to discuss, how we wanted them to approach in pairs, planning tags, which we did a pink triangle. We loved the pink triangle. A lot of us really took that to heart. We had all read about the situation in Germany before World War II, and just kind of felt a kinship with that symbol. So we chose that. Unfortunately, we didn't study hard enough. We had the pink triangle the wrong way. But nevertheless, we made our badges, and we ended up all gathering, and by this time, I was appointed to the council. In activism, the two most important milestones for me, they were kind of personal successes that gave me encouragement to continue and to work harder. And that was helping to see the first lobby day take place in Harrisburg and get notice. It was pretty well picked up by the news media across the state in March of 1976, when 125, somewhere between 125 and 150 people came on bus and by car from all parts of the state and wore our little pink triangle badges and went to legislators' offices. And even though a lot of them laughed at us and joked about it and made fun of it, it got the start. People all across the state knew that there was a group of people who was concerned about something that maybe some of them didn't even have the faintest idea was going to happen, and who vote. So that was the happiest moment, is the day we went to Harrisburg and we gathered, I think down on State Street at a church down there, if I recall correctly, or it could have been, it was Friends Meeting House, I believe. Not on State Street, but Friends Meeting House. We gathered, all 125 of us, we registered. We walked to the Capitol and we paired up in groups of two, and we had the list of legislators, senators, and representatives, and we paired up 2 by 2. And when districts weren't covered, neighboring districts, a couple from that district would try to cover. And I think we did a pretty good job that day, and we had announced a news conference after the lobbying hours were over, and the Harrisburg media, some of the affiliates of the major networks at that time were there, daily papers from Sunbury, Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Allentown, pretty much wherever there were community members that were directly involved. I think the Sunbury Daily Item had a reporter there, mainly because they had received notice ahead of time that one of the co-chairs of the Lobby Day Committee was from their town. So it was published on the front page of the paper, and it was a momentous moment. So the other point that I was, of course, very proud of was being appointed to the Governor's Council. Even though I couldn't remain on there, I was so proud that I got to work with people like Captain Rodriguez of the Pennsylvania State Police. He was one of my contacts. I met with him. He allowed me office space in the state police headquarters here in the Capitol in Harrisburg, gave me access to phone lines and fax machine. One of the assignments that I had as a member of the Governor's Council was they selected a steering committee, and that committee was to more or less be a facilitator of that portion. The state departments were broken up into, as much as could be, closely related segments. So education and health might have been together. I don't know that for a fact at this point. Law and enforcement probably were grouped together. There were different groupings. We had, I think there was the Department of Welfare or, other similar departments that took care of social programs and that type of different departments of state. So as a as a group facilitator, a steering committee member, one of the organizations that I had close contact with was the state police. And Captain Rodriguez was the state police top tier person who was appointed to be our contact. So all contacts, the governor had decreed that all contacts under the governor's office would participate, would provide a department, high-level department member to be a member of the council as a state official to communicate and articulate their department's what their department could do to accommodate what our needs were.